The sun was a bleed of raw color against the western rim of the world, spilling vermilion and hot gold over the high prairie. It was the late 1870s, and here, in the New Mexico territory, the land was a harsh and honest thing. It stretched out until the sky ate it, vast and thirsty, broken only by the purple shadows of distant mesas. Near the small, hopeful cluster of buildings named Bitter Willow, the wind had a voice. It was a low, constant whisper that searched the seams of every plank and worried the dry buffalo grass. Under the long porch of a ranch house built of sturdy, sun-bleached pine, Elias Ward sat on a low stool. He was mending a saddle, his head bent to the task. Elias was a man made of the same quiet, enduring materials as his home. He was not old, perhaps 35, but the silence of the prairie had settled into the lines around his eyes and mouth. His hands, calloused and sure, moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He threaded a leather lace through a fresh hole, his movements deliberate, patient. This was his rhythm. It was the only one he knew. His life was a loop, tied as neatly as the knot he was finishing. He rose before the sun. At 4 a.m, the air sharp and cold in his lungs, he would check the stables, his lantern cutting a small, yellow circle in the immense dark. He'd run his hands over the flanks of his horses, murmuring to them, his voice a low rumble they understood better than any human. He kept 4, all of them strong-limbed and clear-eyed, his only real companions. After the horses, he would walk to the well, the wooden bucket rattling. He'd measure the water level, a meticulous daily ritual, marking it down with a stub of pencil in a worn ledger. It was a language of survival. After that, he'd cook a simple breakfast of bacon and coffee, eat it standing by the stove, and then the day's work would swallow him. Mending fences, clearing brush, checking his small herd of cattle, and always the horses. He was a horse rancher, but his reputation was built on something finer than just breeding. He was a horse listener. He could gentle a spooked Mustang with a quiet hand and a steady breath when other men used ropes and spurs. His day ended as it began, with the chores, and then he would sit here, on this porch, mending tack or carving a piece of wood, and listen to the wind. It was a profound solitude, not a lonely one, for he had long since forgotten the difference. It was just his life, a habit worn smooth as a river stone. The habit broke. He felt it first as a change in the air, a subtle shift in the evening's pulse. He paused. The leather lace held taut in his fingers. He looked up. On the ridge to the east, silhouetted against the last blaze of the dying sun, were 2 riders. They were not cowboys from a neighboring ranch, and they were not the cavalry patrol that sometimes passed through. They were women, and they rode with a straight-backed confidence that was part of the land itself. He watched, his hands frozen. They did not ride like white women, perched uncertainly on side saddles. They rode astride, their movements fluid, a seamless extension of the horses beneath them. They began the slow descent toward his ranch, their forms growing clearer as the twilight deepened. Elias set the saddle carefully aside. He stood up, wiping his hands on his canvas trousers. His heart had begun a low, unfamiliar pounding against his ribs. Visitors were rare. 2 women, alone, at dusk, were unheard of. They stopped about 20 yards from his porch, their horses breathing hard but steady. The jingle of their bridles and the soft stamp of hooves on the hard-packed earth were the only sounds. The woman on the left was still, her presence as solid as the rock of the mesas. Her face was calm, her eyes dark and unreadable, fixed on him. She was Ishta Greywing. The woman on the right was broader in the shoulder, younger perhaps, but with a sharp, assessing energy. Her black hair was pulled into 2 long, thick braids that hung past her waist. She was Kiona Stonebird. They were from the Red Mesa Band, a people who had lived on this land long before the maps called it New Mexico. Elias waited. He was a man who knew how to wait. It was Ishta who spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried clearly in the cool air, cutting through the whisper of the wind. It was a voice without preamble, a voice that stated facts. "We want a child," she said. Elias's world tilted. The porch beneath his feet felt unsteady. He was sure he had misheard. Ishta continued, her gaze unwavering. We need a man who keeps his word more than he likes to fire his gun. The blood rushed into Elias's face, a hot, prickling tide that rose from his collar to the roots of his hair. He was a man who rarely spoke and never blushed. Yet here he was, burning in the twilight. His sure hands, the hands that could gentle a wild horse, became clumsy, alien things. He fumbled for the awl he had set down, his fingers knocking it. It skittered across the wooden planks. He bent to retrieve it, and his shoulder bumped the small tin cup of water he kept on the railing. It tipped, falling to the porch with a sharp, metallic clatter. The sound was obscenely loud in the vast quiet. It echoed, a lonely, tinny sound that seemed to underscore the sudden, shocking break in his life. The water pooled darkly on the boards. He straightened up, empty-handed, his face crimson. He could not look at them. Ishta watched his discomfort without judgment, as if it were simply a fact, like the weather. She spoke again, her tone measured, explaining. The winter sickness took many of our young men, she said. Our line is thin. The cradle boards are empty. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. We must have children, or we are finished. Elias swallowed, his throat dry. He understood sickness. He understood loss, but he did not understand why they were here, on his porch, as if hearing his unspoken question. Ishta went on. We have watched you. We have listened. The men in Bitter Willow talk loud. They drink. They fight over cards. They are not what we need. Her eyes softened, just a fraction. Then we heard the story of the gray gelding you bought from the freighter, the one with the whip scars. Elias remembered. A terrified animal, all bone and flinching muscle. They said you spent 3 moons sleeping in the barn, just talking to it, until it learned to trust your hand. She held his gaze. We were told you speak to your horses kinder than most men speak to their wives. Elias felt the words like a physical blow. It was the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud, by this woman, stripped him bare. The other woman, Kiona, shifted in her saddle. Her voice was lower, rougher than Ishta's. We are not asking for marriage, she said, her words sharp, slicing through any misunderstanding he might be clinging to. She saw the confusion and panic warring in his eyes. We are not asking you to leave your ranch or to join our people. We are not asking for a ring or a paper from your town. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. We are asking for a seed given with a promise of respect, a life, given to women who will raise it to be strong and good. This clarification did not help. It made it worse. It stripped the request of any familiar ritual, any societal buffer he might have hidden behind. It was raw, direct, and terrifyingly real. He was a man who dealt in the tangible, in leather and wood, in fence posts and water levels, in the solid warmth of horseflesh. This was a thing of blood, and life, and promises he did not understand. The wind picked up, a sudden gust sweeping across the porch, carrying the clean, dry scent of cured grass and the faint, dusty smell of the women's buckskin. He could smell the sage and the smoke from their journey. His loneliness, which for so long had been a comfortable coat, suddenly felt thin and cold. He was exposed. That ingrained, absolute solitude was cracking. And in the fissure, something new and startling was pushing through. It was a profound, paralyzing fear of the unknown, fear of this vulnerability, fear of failing at something so fundamentally human. But beneath the fear, tiny and insistent as a blade of grass pushing through hard-baked earth, there was another feeling. It was a flicker of curiosity, a spark of warmth in a hearth that had been cold for a decade. These women were not asking for his money, or his land, or his name. They were asking for his help, for life itself, and they had chosen him. Him, the quiet man, the shy rancher. He finally found his voice. It came out rough, a whisper scraped from a dry throat. He did not look at them. He looked at the fallen cup, at the dark water stain spreading on the wood. He began, and had to stop to clear his throat. He tried again. I need to understand. I need to understand everything you ask, and everything I must keep. They did not wait on his porch for an answer he did not have. As the last of the light faded and the stars emerged, sharp and cold in the indigo sky, the two women moved with quiet purpose. They led their horses to the stand of cottonwoods that marked the path of Dry Lantern Creek. 100 yards from his house, Elias watched from his window, a shadow behind the glass. He saw them unload their packs. They did not build a fire. In the moonlight, he saw the pale, conical shape of a hide lodge rise from the creek bank. They were staying. The finality of the act sent a fresh wave of unease through him. It was an occupation, gentle but firm. They were not asking, they were waiting, and they would wait on his land. He slept poorly, his mind a tangle of their words. We want a child. He woke at his usual time, 4 a.m. The dark still thick and heavy. He lit his lantern, the familiar routine a comfort. As he walked toward the stables, he saw a sliver of light from the seams of the lodge. They were awake, too. His oldest horse, Eclipse, a dark bay gelding with a silver muzzle, was favoring his left foreleg. Elias ran his hand down the leg, murmuring, "Easy, old friend. What have you done now?" He found it just as the first gray light touched the horizon, a deep crack in the hoof wall, packed with grit. He retrieved his tools, the hoof pick, the knife, the rasp. He sat on his low stool, pulled Eclipse's hoof onto his leather-clad knee, and began the slow, patient work. It was delicate, carving out the packed dirt and the damaged hoof without touching the quick. He worked with his head bent, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Just stand," he whispered to the horse. "I know it hurts. Just stand easy. I've got you." The horse, which had been tense, let out a long sigh and relaxed its weight onto Elias's knee, a perfect act of trust. He did not know how long she had been there. He finished trimming the hoof, satisfied, and was preparing a poultice of pine tar and oakum when a shadow fell over his hands. He looked up, startled. It was Kiona. She was standing just outside the stable door, arms crossed. Her expression was hard to read. She had been watching him, studying his hands, his voice, the way his shoulders hunched in concentration. He had been so absorbed. He hadn't heard her approach. She said nothing. Her gaze flicked from his face to the horse's hoof, then back. He saw a deep frown line between her brows, an expression of intense scrutiny. Then, as Eclipse nuzzled Elias's shoulder, looking for a treat, Kiona's expression changed. It was not a smile, but the hard lines of her face softened, the suspicion easing. She simply turned and walked away toward the creek. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He felt as if he had just passed some silent, crucial test. Later that morning, he went to the well. Ishta was there, waiting. She held a small, sharp piece of flint. "We will help," she said. It was not a question. "Show us the work." Elias was a man who worked alone. The idea of help was as foreign as the request they had made. I measure the water, every day." He lowered the wooden bucket, marked on the inside with ruled lines, and drew it up. He noted the level, pulled the worn ledger from his back pocket, and made his mark. Ishta stepped forward. She looked at his pencil mark, then at the heavy wooden post of the wellhead. "This is your measure," she said. She placed the tip of her flint against the wood and, with a few quick, deft strokes, carved a different symbol. It was a small, tight circle with a line through the center. "This is ours," she said, "so we may both watch the water. The land speaks in more than one tongue." Elias stared at the two marks, side by side on the weathered pine, his neat pencil number and her ancient, carved sigil. They were two ways of saying the same thing. "The water is this low, the well is this deep." He nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. It felt right. The day settled into a new rhythm. Elias went to his small, fallow plot, a patch of earth his mother had tended. He had a sack of seeds, a peculiar mix his mother had sworn by a hardy rye, some tough millet, and a scattering of beans. It was a frugal blend. designed to survive drought. He poured the seeds into his palm, the familiar weight a comfort. As he prepared to rake the soil, Ishta joined him. She carried a bundle of dried sage. She did not ask permission. She simply walked the perimeter of the small plot, crumbling the silver-gray leaves in her hand, letting the fragments catch the wind. She murmured something too low for him to hear, a song or a prayer. Elias paused, his rake halfway to the ground. He was a practical man, a man of fences and ledgers. She was a woman of wind and herbs. Yet they were both here, trying to make something grow from the same stubborn patch of dirt. He waited until she was finished. Then he began to rake the seeds into the earth, her ritual smoke still hanging in the air. That evening, he cooked more than he usually did. A larger pot of stew, thick with potatoes and a little salt pork. He felt awkward, but the thought of them eating cold rations by the creek felt wrong. He walked to their lodge, the pot heavy in his hand. "I have extra," he mumbled, holding it out. They accepted without ceremony. They brought their own bowls and spoons and sat at his rough-hewn table. The silence in the small cabin was thick, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the crackle of the fire. It was Kiona who broke it. She was looking into the flames. "The winter before this one," she said, her voice quiet. "The cold came early. It came like a knife. We had a small herd of cattle, my father's herd." Elias stopped eating, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He did not look at her. He looked at the fire, giving her the courtesy of his attention, not his stare. The snow came up to a man's waist. For 2 moons, the world was white and silent. We ran out of hay. We tried to move them to the canyon, but they were too weak. She paused. I watched them die, one by one. They would lie down, and the snow would cover them. My father, he sat by the fire and did not speak for a month. Elias said nothing. He knew the pain of losing stock. He knew the helplessness of a bad winter. He did not offer empty comforts. He did not say, "That's a hard thing." He simply stood, picked up the kettle from the stove, and refilled her tin cup with hot, black tea. He placed another log on the fire, the sparks hissing up the chimney. Kiona looked at his hand as he set the kettle down. It was a steady hand. She picked up her cup, her shoulders seeming to lose some of their rigid tension. Later that night, the world went sharp with fear. A high, keening howl split the dark. A wolf, close, too close. In the stable, the horses exploded into a panic of snorting, rearing, and the terrible sound of hooves striking wood. Elias was out of his chair and moving before the echo faded. He grabbed his lantern, expecting the women to follow, perhaps with a rifle, but he didn't wait. He ran to the stable and threw open the door. The air was thick with dust and the smell of their terror. His mare, Daisy, was trying to climb the wall of her stall, her eyes white. Eclipse was kicking rhythmically at the door. Elias did not shout. He did not grab a rope. He walked into the center of the chaos, setting the lantern on a post. The horses shied from him, their bodies trembling. "Easy," he said, his voice the same low rumble he used for gentling. "I am here. It is just the wind, just the wind." He went to the mare, not reaching for her, but simply standing near her stall. He placed one hand on the wooden rail. He did not look at her. He looked at the floor. He took a deep, slow breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The mare snorted, her body a coiled spring. He breathed again, in, out, a long, slow rhythm. He made his body calm. He willed the panic out of his own heart. The mare watched him, her ears swiveling. She stomped, but the frantic energy was lessening. He took another breath. She blew out a long breath in return, a near-perfect echo. He slowly, so slowly, lifted his hand and placed it on her neck. He just held it there, his own pulse steady and slow, breathing with her until the trembling stopped. He moved to the next stall, and the next, repeating the action. His calm was a balm, spreading through the stable, quieting the storm. He turned, his work done, and saw Ishta and Kiona standing in the doorway. They had been watching the entire thing. Ishta's eyes were dark, reflective in the lantern light. She looked at him, at this quiet man who had faced a stampede with nothing but his own breath, and she turned to her cousin. She spoke in their own tongue first, then translated, her voice soft. "He is not strong in the way men boast," she murmured, her gaze fixed on Elias. "He does not break things to make them obey, but he is durable. He is durable like stone. He endures." Elias felt the now familiar heat in his face. He felt seen, in a way that made his bones ache. He found his courage. "I am not," he started, his voice rough. "I am not a brave man. I am not what you think." Kiona stepped forward, her scrutiny returning. "What are you, then?" Elias looked at his hands, still resting on the stall door. "I am afraid," he said, the admission torn from him. "I am afraid of getting it wrong. I am afraid of mistakes, of causing harm. I fear that more than I fear a wolf. I fear it more than I fear what the men in town will say." He looked up, meeting Kiona's gaze. "I fear this choice, because I do not know how to do it right." The admission hung in the dusty air. Kiona's expression froze. She recognized his words. She saw her own fear of failing her people, of choosing poorly, reflected in this shy rancher's eyes. It was the same fear. She had mistaken his quiet for weakness. She saw now that it was caution. It was a deep, profound sense of consequence. A new understanding passed between the three of them. The tension broke, replaced by a weary truce. "We will not ask you again," Ishta said, her voice gentle. "Not yet." Kiona nodded. The decision made. "We will work. You will work. We will stay for 1 week, 7 days." Ishta finished the thought. "You will not give an answer. We will not ask for one. For 7 days. We will just be. We will work this land together, and we will listen. The land will tell us if this is right." Elias nodded, the relief so strong his knees felt weak. 1 week. He could do that. He could work. He could listen. He could breathe. The 5 days of truce had passed in a rhythm of shared labor. A new language was being formed, one made of passing a hammer, of sharing a bucket, of sitting at the same table in a silence that had become less empty and more full. Elias was mending a fence line on the 6th morning when he saw the dust. It was not a single plume, but 3, moving steadily from the direction of Red Mesa. He set his tools down. Beside him, Kiona, who had been helping him stretch the wire, also looked up. Her body went rigid. "They are coming," she said. "Who?" Elias asked, though he already knew. "The ones who must agree." Ishta joined them, walking from the creek, her hands damp. She watched the riders approach, her face calm, but her stillness was the stillness of a deep, held breath. The 3 riders who reined in their horses in front of the small ranch house were of a different age and energy than the 2 women. They were the past, come to bargain for the future. The one in the center was a woman so old her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes holding a bright, undiminished wisdom. This was Lark of Dawn, an aunt to Ishta and Kiona, a matriarch of their line. Beside her sat Thomas Redfeather, a man in his 50s, his face hard as canyon rock, his hair bound in 2 silver-streaked braids. He was a keeper of their laws, and his eyes were sharp and skeptical. The third was an ancient man, Najo 7 Stars, the keeper of the songs. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, but he sat his horse with perfect balance, his head tilted as if he were listening to the heartbeat of the land itself. Ishta and Kiona stood on the porch, but slightly to the side. Elias found himself standing alone in the center, his hands, stained with earth and rust, hanging awkwardly at his sides. It was Thomas Redfeather who spoke, his voice a low growl that seemed to rise from the ground. He did not look at Ishta or Kiona. He fixed his gaze on Elias, a gaze that stripped him bare. "An outsider," Thomas said, the word an accusation. He looked Elias up and down, taking in his simple work clothes, his quiet stance. "A shy one. Our nieces have come to you with a request that honors you, but it puts our bloodline at risk." He leaned forward. "What guarantee do you offer, white man, that our blood will not be scorned, that a child from this union will not be treated as a half-thing, unwelcome in your world and lost to ours. The air grew thin. The silence that followed was a heavy weight. Elias's heart was a hammer against his ribs. He felt the familiar, hot rush of panic, the desire to look away, to retreat to the safety of his stable. He could feel Ishta's gaze on him, and Kiona's. They were not helping him. They were waiting. He met Thomas's stare. He thought of his horses, of the wolf, of the fear he had admitted, and he found his voice. It was not loud, but in the silence, it was as clear as a bell. "I have 2 things," Elias said, his throat tight. "Only 2. I have these." He held up his hands, palms forward. "They are calloused. They know how to work. And they have never, not once, been raised to strike a woman." He let his hands fall. "The second thing is a habit. When I start a job, mending a fence, gentling a horse, I see it through to the end. I do not know how to quit halfway." Thomas Redfeather let out a short, harsh laugh. "Hands and habits," he scoffed. "A fine sentiment, but willpower does not stop a spear. A habit does not stop a bullet from a white man's gun when he decides he does not like the look of your child." Before Elias could answer, Kiona stepped forward, her voice a sharp blade. "No," she said, her eyes flashing at Thomas. "But it stops betrayal. It stops a promise from breaking. A spear only breaks the body. Betrayal breaks the future. His hands may be quiet, but they are not empty." A tense silence fell between Kiona and the lawkeeper, but the old woman, Lark of Dawn, had not been listening to the words. She had been watching Elias. Her gaze was not hostile, just deeply, profoundly searching. She had seen him when he arrived, seen the way he checked his horse's leg before his own comfort. Now, her eyes drifted to his wrist. Earlier that morning, Eclipse's cracked hoof had been weeping. Elias had cleaned it and applied a fresh poultice to hold it in place. He had taken a piece of clean baling twine and, with quick, practiced motions, tied a complex series of knots that cradled the hoof, distributing the pressure, protecting the tender flesh. The end of the twine was still wrapped around his wrist. Lark of Dawn's eyes narrowed. She recognized the knot. It was a variation of a tie her own people used, a cradle knot, taught by mothers to hold a splint, or to secure a baby in a cradle board so it could breathe freely but never fall. It was not a knot of binding. It was a knot of care, a knot for mending, a knot that does not slip. She looked from the twine on his wrist to his steady, anxious eyes. She saw the man Ishta had described, not a breaking wind, but the durable stone. She raised her hand, a slight, gentle motion that silenced Thomas instantly. Her voice, when it came, was soft, like dry leaves skittering on hard earth. But it commanded the air. "We have seen your hands, Elias Ward," she said, using his name for the first time. "Kiona speaks truth. You are a man who mends, but the price for this mending is high, for all of us." The ancient songkeeper, Najo 7 Stars, spoke, his voice a dry rustle. "A child of 2 bloods must have both songs," he whispered, his blind eyes turned toward Elias. "If it only has one, it will be lost in the wind, belonging nowhere." Lark of Dawn nodded, her gaze holding Elias. "If you agree to this thing our nieces ask, you must understand the terms. This is not a simple trade. You are not just giving a seed. You are planting a tree, and you will be bound to tend it." She laid out the agreement, the words falling like stones, each one landing with weight. "First, the child will be of our people. It will carry our name. It will be raised in our ways. You will not claim it under your laws, or try to take it to your church. Second," she continued, "you must learn our ways. You will learn the song to greet the dawn, so the child may hear its father's voice in our own tongue. Najo will teach you. Third, your protection will be your labor. We do not ask you to fight for us. We have fighters." Her gaze flicked to Kiona, then back. "We ask you to provide, to mend, to keep the well clear and the roof strong. Our bloodline does not come from violence, and it will not be protected by it. You will swear never to raise your hand." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. This was not a moment. This was a life. This was a rewriting of his entire existence. They were asking him to become a part of their world, a world he knew nothing about. The fear returned, cold and sharp, but it was different. It was no longer the fear of them. It was the fear of failing them. He looked past the elders, to Ishta, who watched him with a painful, quiet hope. He looked at Kiona, who watched him with a challenging intensity, daring him to be the man she had defended. He turned back to Lark of Dawn. His voice was unsteady, but he forced the words out. I need more time." Thomas Redfeather snorted, about to speak, but Elias raised his hand, echoing Lark's gesture, a motion of desperation, not authority. "No, please," he said quickly. "Not to say no, not to run. I need time to learn, to see if I am capable of what you ask. A man should not make a promise he does not understand. I don't know your songs. I don't know your ways. I would be lying if I said yes today. I will not lie to you." The elders looked at each other. Thomas was skeptical, his face a mask of disapproval. But Najo, the songkeeper, tilted his head and smiled, a faint, crackling expression. He murmured something to Lark of Dawn. She nodded. "It is a wise answer," she said. "Better a slow truth than a fast lie. You have until the first frost, but the learning begins now." The three elders prepared to leave, but as Tamas turned his horse, Najo 7 Stars urged his own mount forward. He stopped directly in front of Elias. From inside his worn shirt, he pulled a small buckskin pouch. It was dark with age, almost black, and beaded with a pattern of stars. The leather thong that tied it was worn thin. "Our grandmothers carried these," the old man whispered. His blind eyes seemed to look through Elias. "From the before time. They are our story. They are our future. They must be planted in soil that is worthy." He held the pouch out. Elias looked at it, his hand frozen. He did not know if he was meant to take it. Najo pushed it forward, insistently. "Take them." Slowly, Elias lifted his hand and cupped it. The old man dropped the pouch into his palm. It was surprisingly heavy and warm, as if it held the sun. Elias could feel the small, hard shapes of the seeds through the soft leather. The 3 elders turned and rode away, their backs straight, not looking back. They disappeared over the same ridge where Ishta and Kiona had first appeared. Elias was left standing in the yard, the pouch in his hand, the weight of a generation in his palm. He felt the gazes of the 2 women. He turned to them, his hand open, showing them the pouch. He was lost. Ishta walked down from the porch. She came to him and stopped, looking at the pouch. He thought she would take it from him, take back the burden. Instead, she placed her hand over his, her fingers covering the pouch, pressing the ancient, warm leather into his skin. Her hand was strong and dry. "You will hold them," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "You will keep them safe until you know how to plant them." It was the first test. It was not a question. He closed his fingers, his knuckles white, his hand trembling slightly around the pouch and the warmth of her hand. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he gave a clear, deliberate nod. It took less than 2 days for the wind to carry the story to Bitter Willow, and like a dry tumbleweed, it caught burrs and thorns as it rolled. It started, as these things do, in the Silver Spur Saloon. A freighter, who had stopped at Elias's ranch to water his team, had seen the 2 women, seen the hide lodge by the creek. He had seen Elias, his face red, speaking with them. By the time the freighter had his second whiskey, the story was set. "Hold up out there," the freighter announced to the smoky room. "Ward, the quiet one. Got himself 2 native women out at his place, living right by the creek." A man at the bar, nursing a beer, snorted. "Ward. He's too shy to buy a bag of flour if the store's crowded. What'd he do? Scare him into staying?" "Didn't look scared," the freighter said, enjoying the attention. "They're from the Red Mesa band, and they ain't hiding. Rode right up to his porch. I'd say they're the ones in charge. The whispers blossomed. 2 of 'em. Heard they were asking for a child. Paying him. Nah, they're claiming him. An arrangement. The laughter was loud and crude. The men in the saloon found it a fine joke. The shy rancher and his pair of squaws. The jests were ugly, tinged with a mean-spirited envy and a deep, racial disdain. But the story did not stay in the saloon. It crossed the dusty street and found its way into the general store, the blacksmith's shop, and, by Sunday, into the white-steepled church. There. The story was not a joke. It was a sin. Reverend Jonas Pike was a man who saw the world in stark, unbending lines of black and white. He was tall and thin, with a voice that could make the word neighbor sound like a judgment. He stood at his pulpit, the Bible open in his hand, his gaze sweeping over his small congregation. "A sickness has come to our community," he boomed, his voice vibrating with a righteous fury. "A moral rot, settling upon a soul we thought was merely quiet, but in that quiet, a darkness has taken root." The pews rustled. Everyone knew who he meant. "We are a God-fearing town, a bastion of decency in a wild land. We will not suffer an unnatural, unholy arrangement to fester in our midst. We will not allow the laws of God and man to be spat upon." He pointed a long, bony finger toward the window, in the direction of Elias's ranch. "This arrangement threatens the sanctity of our homes, the purity of our families, and it threatens the very land we stand on." The threat was not just spiritual. Reverend Pike had found a practical weapon. That man's access to the water of Dry Lantern Creek is a privilege, a community grant, not a right. I say, let us petition the Territorial Council. Why should our community provide water for an establishment of open sin? The amens were fervent. The women of the congregation, in particular, looked horrified. Their small, orderly world felt threatened. There was one man in the pews who did not say amen. He was not a regular churchgoer, but he had made a point to be there. His name was Magnus Felton. Felton was a man of contracts, not scripture. He was the chief contractor for the new railroad spur, and he had a problem. His steam engines were thirsty, and the railroad's current water source was a shallow, unreliable well. Felton had been looking at Elias Ward's ranch for a month, not for the land, which was merely average, but for the steady, year-round flow of Dry Lantern Creek. He had heard the saloon whispers and seen his opportunity. Now, hearing Reverend Pike, he saw the lever. A moral crusade was the perfect cover for a commercial acquisition. The next day, Felton paid a visit to the town's part-time lawman, Deputy Cole Bristow. Bristow was a broad, beefy man who wore his badge with a self-importance that outweighed his authority. "Cole," Felton said, clapping him on the shoulder, "I'm concerned about our friend Elias Ward." "Ward," Bristow said, surprised. "He's no trouble. Maybe not." Felton lowered his voice. "You've heard the stories. 2 native women, living on his property, unmarried. It's irregular, and with the railroad survey pushing through. I'm concerned about safety, tensions. You understand. I think a safety inspection is in order, just to make sure everything's on the level. Check for weapons, squatters, that sort of thing." Bristow puffed out his chest. "A safety inspection. Right, official business." He rode out to the ranch that afternoon. Elias was in the stable, rubbing down his mare, when Bristow's shadow fell across the door. Ishta and Kiona were down at the creek, washing clothes. "Ward," Bristow said, not bothering with a greeting. He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the clean, orderly space. "Got a report of irregularities. Just here to conduct a safety inspection." Elias's heart jumped. "Safety? There's no danger here. I'll be the judge of that." Bristow began to poke around, kicking at a hay bale, peering into the feed bin. "Got company, I hear." Elias said nothing, his hands tightening on the curry comb. He just stood, watching. Bristow moved to Elias's small workbench. He picked up a leather awl, then set it down. His eyes landed on a small, dark object half hidden under a clean cloth. It was the buckskin pouch Najo 7 Stars had given him. Elias had been carrying it, but had set it down while he worked, afraid of sweating on it. Before Elias could move, Bristow snatched it. "What's this, a medicine bag?" he sneered, his fingers fumbling with the leather thong. "Don't!" The word was out of Elias before he could stop it. It was sharp, louder than his own voice. Bristow paused, surprised by the tone. "Don't what, Ward? Don't touch your pagan trinkets." He pulled the pouch open and shook a few of the dark, heavy seeds into his palm. "Just seeds. It's not yours," Elias said. He moved, not in anger, but in a solid, protective instinct. He put himself between Bristow and the workbench, his hand held out. "Give it back, please. Get out of my way. Ward, this is official business." Bristow shoved Elias in the shoulder. It was not a hard shove, but it was enough. Elias stumbled back, but then planted his feet. He did not raise his hands. He did not shove back. He just stood there, blocking the deputy's path. "It's not yours," he repeated, his voice low and shaking. "It was a trust." "I said, move!" Bristow raised his hand to shove him again. Harder this time. "He will not move." The voice came from the stable door. It was Kiona. She stood there, her hands empty, her wet clothes clinging to her arms. She had walked up from the creek, silent as a shadow. Her eyes were not angry. They were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. She looked at Bristow's raised hand, then at his face. Cole Bristow was a town bully. He was used to cowing drunken cowboys and nervous shopkeepers. He was not used to this. He was not used to a woman who looked at him as if he were a minor, irritating obstacle, and not a threat. His hand wavered. This is a safety inspection," he blustered, his voice losing its edge. "You are finished," Kiona stated. It was not a question. "You found no danger. Now you will leave." Bristow looked from Kiona's unblinking stare to Elias's stubborn, quiet refusal. He was one man, and they were two, and one of them. She looked like she could break him in half without a sound. He suddenly felt very alone. He cursed, a low, frustrated sound. He threw the seeds in the pouch onto the workbench. "Fine, but you're on notice. Ward, the whole town's watching you." He stomped out of the stable, mounted his horse, and rode off, his dignity in tatters. Elias sagged against the stall, his legs trembling. He carefully scooped the seeds back into the pouch, his fingers clumsy. Kiona watched him, then gave a single, sharp nod, and returned to the creek. The next visitor was Magnus Felton. He came the following day, dressed in a clean suit, his hat in his hand. He was all smiles. "Mr. Ward," he said, "a terrible misunderstanding yesterday. Deputy Bristow can be overzealous. I'm here to apologize on his behalf." Elias just nodded, wary. "The truth is, Elias, may I call you Elias? The truth is, you're in a tight spot." Felton gestured to the lodge by the creek. "I'm a practical man. I don't judge. But the town, Reverend Pike, they're not as understanding. They're talking about your water rights. They're talking about running you out." He put a fatherly hand on Elias's shoulder. "I'm here to offer you a solution, a way out. I'll buy this place from you. Cash, $200, more than it's worth. Frankly, but I'll take it off your hands. And you and your friends can move on, find somewhere, quieter. I'll handle Pike. I'll make all this trouble disappear." $200 was a joke. The land and the water rights alone were worth 10 times that. It was a vulture's offer. Elias looked at Felton's smiling, reasonable face. He thought of the seeds in his pocket. He thought of Ishta's quiet strength, of Kiona's fierce defense, of the promise he had not yet made. "No," Elias said. Felton's smile faltered. "No, son. You're not thinking clearly. This is a good offer." "It's a low offer," Elias said, his voice quiet but steady. "And this is my home. It's not for sale." Felton's eyes went cold. The smile vanished. "You're making a mistake, Ward, a big one." He put his hat on. When Pike is done with you, and you've got no water and no friends, my offer will be 100. Remember that. Felton rode off, his back stiff. The final blow came in the mail. A small, printed handbill. Reverend Pike was calling a public dialogue at the church. Sunday next. The entire town was invited to discuss the moral character of our community and the stewardship of our shared resources. It was a trial, disguised as a prayer meeting. Elias held the paper in his hand, the cheap ink staining his thumb. He felt the walls closing in. The paper and laws of the white world and the dry, unbending morality of the town were squeezing him. He sat on the porch, the handbill on his knee, the setting sun a painful reminder of that first evening. Ishta and Kiona sat with him. They had seen the deputy. They had seen Felton. Now they saw the handbill. They will use their laws to break you, Kiona said, her voice flat. They will take your water. It is a trial, Ishta said, her gaze on the distant church steeple, barely visible. They mean to shame you, so you will leave. Elias felt a surge of despair. Then what can I do? I cannot fight the whole town. Ishta was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to him. You cannot fight them with their weapons. You cannot out-talk the reverend. You cannot outspend the railroad man. Then what? They have invited the town to listen to Reverend Pike, Ishta said, a new, sharp intelligence in her eyes. We will invite them to listen as well. They have their elders. You have yours. My elders. Elias was confused. The ones in town, the ones who remember the land before the railroad, Mrs. Gable, whose husband you helped, Old Man Hemlock, who buys your horses, the ones who listen to the land, not just to the pulpit. We will not prepare for a debate. We will prepare for a song. Elias looked at her. A song? The dawn song. The one your elders asked you to learn. We will invite them here, to your home, on Sunday morning, before the Reverend's meeting. We will show them what we are. Not a sin, a beginning. Elias looked from the church bell in the distance to the hide lodge by the creek. He was caught between them. One was a bell, calling him to repent. The other was a drum, waiting to be struck. He had to choose, or maybe he realized he didn't. Maybe he had to find a way to make them both exist. He looked at the handbill, then at the seed pouch he had placed on the railing. A decision was forming, sharp and clear as a winter morning. If he was to say yes to these women, if he was to accept this life, it could not be a secret. It could not be a thing of shame hidden by a creek. It had to be as strong as the Reverend's law, and as enduring as Ishta's. He needed a legal roof, a paper that would stand up in Felton's world. And he needed a vow, a song. That would be true in theirs. He had to build a house that had room for both. The sky had been a tense, bruised purple for 2 days, pressing down on the prairie with a heavy, humid stillness. It was the kind of weather that promised relief but never gave it. There was the smell of ozone in the air, a metallic tang that made the horses restless, skittering at shadows, their ears flat. Lark of Dawn had arrived that morning, not on horseback, but in a small, sturdy cart. She had come, she'd said, to sit in the shade and listen, to see if the land would accept Elias. She sat on the porch, her hands quiet in her lap, watching as Elias and Kiona worked to reset a fence post. Then the sky broke. It was not a crackle of thunder, but a single, violent, blinding zip of white-blue light. It struck the northern ridge, the one closest to his property line, hitting a dead, dry pine. For a second, there was absolute silence. Then, a puff of gray smoke, like a signal. The wind, the cruel south wind that had been blowing all day, hit the smoke. It fanned the small cloud into a plume, and the plume into an angry orange blossom. The fire was born. No, Elias whispered, his hands freezing on the post-hole digger. Kiona was already moving. The wind is from the south. It will push it back on itself. But as if the land itself were cursed, the wind died. For a long, terrible minute, the air was perfectly still. The fire grew. eating the dry grass in a perfect, hungry circle, and then the wind shifted. A new, hot breath came from the north, straight down the draw, aimed directly at the ranch. "It's turning!" Kiona shouted. The fire roared, a low, guttural sound, and began to move. It was not a creeping burn. It was a running, leaping thing, a wall of flame rolling down the ridge, faster than a man could run. The horses screamed. It was a sound of pure, animal terror. The small herd, grazing near the barn, exploded. They wheeled, their eyes white, and began a blind stampede. Not away from the fire, but parallel to it, heading for the very fence line Elias was mending. Elias's panic lasted only a second. The man who feared social judgment vanished, and the horseman took his place. "The gully!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the roar. "The creek bed, Kiona! Ride, turn them south!" He ran to the barn, ignoring the heat already washing over his face. He grabbed a long lead rope and burst into the stall of Eclipse. The old horse was trembling, but his trust in Elias was stronger than his fear. Elias snapped the rope onto his halter, vaulted onto his bare back, and kicked him into a run. "Come on, old friend, we lead them!" He burst from the barn, his long, sharp two-note whistle slicing the air. It was the call he used for feed, the call for safety. The panicked herd heard it. A few heads turned. Kiona was a blur of motion. She had sprinted to her own horse, vaulted on, and was already riding hard. Not with Elias, but straight at the fire. She rode like a demon, a wet cloth tied over her face, charging along the western flank of the fire, whooping and yelling, her body low over the horse's neck. She was a living wall, forcing the fire to turn east, away from the open prairie and funneling it directly into the narrow gully that led to the creek. Ishta was not idle. She was not a rider in this moment. She was an earth mover. She ran to the long, heavy wooden water trough by the well, with a strength Elias had not known she possessed. She heaved it over, spilling the water, soaking the ground. She began to drag the heavy, sodden thing, scraping a wide, muddy line in the hard-baked earth, a desperate, hopeless fire break. It was then he saw Lark of Dawn. The old woman had left the porch, trying to get to the small root cellar. But the smoke was thick, and the ground was treacherous, riven with deep cracks from the long drought. As Elias galloped past with Eclipse, he saw her stumble. She fell hard. Near the very fence line the horses were stampeding toward. She cried out, a thin, bird-like sound, and tried to rise, but her ankle had twisted. Elias's heart stopped. The herd was behind him, coming fast. The fire was to his left, roaring, and the elder was in the path. He didn't think. He threw himself from Eclipse, slapping the horse's rump. Go on!" The old gelding, trained for this, continued the run, and the herd, seeing their leader, followed him down into the gully. Elias ran, the smoke tearing at his lungs. He reached Lark of Dawn as the first of the panicked horses thundered past, just yards away. The heat was searing. He ripped his own jacket off, plunged it into the muddy line Ishta had scraped, and threw the soaking, heavy wool over the old woman. "Hold on!" he yelled. He didn't try to lift her gently. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing and ran, his legs burning. He plunged into a deep, dry fissure in the earth, a scar in the land, using it as a trench. He shielded her with his body as the last of the herd passed, their hooves shaking the ground. He carried her through the smoke, coughing, his eyes streaming, and deposited her on the relative safety of the porch, where Ishta was already beating out a small spark on the wooden planks. He didn't wait for thanks. He turned and ran back into the inferno. The main herd was safe, funneled by Kiona's riding and Elias's lead horse into the shallow creek bed, where the sparse grass was damp. But as he reached the mouth of the gully, he heard a new sound, a high, terrified whinny. A young foal, not more than 3 months old, had been separated from its mother. In its panic, it had tried to jump a narrow wash, and its leg was wedged tight between 2 jagged rocks. The mother, Daisy, ran in frantic circles around it, refusing to go to safety. The fire was almost on them. The gas on the gully's rim was already burning. Elias ran, pulling the wet cloth Kiona had dropped from his neck. He tied it over his face and dropped to his hands and knees. The air was clearer low to the ground. He crawled under the rolling black smoke, the heat blistering the back of his neck. He reached the foal. It kicked, screaming, its eyes rolling white. "Easy, easy!" He choked, his voice a rasp. He grabbed the small, trapped leg. The rock was sharp. It had sliced the foal's cannon bone. He put his shoulder against the rock and heaved, but it wouldn't budge. He could hear the fire crackling just behind him. He was coughing, snot and tears streaming down his face, his lungs on fire. He couldn't get a purchase. "I won't leave you," he gasped, grabbing the small leg with both hands. He pulled, bracing his feet, ignoring the foal's scream of pain. He would not let it burn. A shadow fell over him. Kiona was there. She had appeared out of the smoke like a vengeful spirit, her face a mask of soot, her braids singed. She didn't speak. She grabbed Elias by the collar of his shirt with one hand and the foal's neck with the other. With a single, explosive grunt of effort, she hauled all three of them, Elias, the foal, and herself, backward, rolling them into the creek bed just as the bush they had been under exploded into a torch. The fire hit the wide, damp banks of Dry Lantern Creek and stopped. The roar died, replaced by a furious hissing, a wall of steam, and the sharp, sickening smell of burnt grass and singed hair. Silence fell, absolute and heavy, broken only by the ragged coughing of three people and the nervous stamping of horses. Elias lay on his back in the mud, gasping for air, his lungs aching. He was covered in soot, his hands bloody, his eyebrows gone. Kiona knelt beside him, breathing just as hard. The foal, its leg bleeding but free, scrambled to its mother. Ishta walked toward them from the house, her arms red and raw from dragging the trough. She looked at the blackened land, at the safe horses, at Kiona, and then at Elias, who was just pushing himself to a sitting position. Their eyes met through the haze. He was a wreck. He had failed to stop the fire. He had been saved by Kiona. He felt like a failure. But Ishta's expression was not one of pity. It was one of profound, unadorned respect. She looked at him, this quiet man, covered in filth and bleeding, and she gave a single, sharp nod. It was a nod that said, "I see you." It was a nod that said, "We are equals." It was enough. Later, as the sun set on a landscape of black, Lark of Dawn sat on the porch, her ankle propped on a stool, wrapped in a clean bandage Elias had provided. He brought her a cup of water, his hands shaking from exhaustion. She did not take the cup. Instead, she took his hand. Her fingers were dry and warm, closing over his burnt, trembling ones. "You do not boast courage," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "You do not ride out looking for a fight. You just do what is right. When the time comes, that is a stronger thing." News of the fire traveled fast. A rancher from the next valley over had seen the smoke plume and ridden to help, only to find the fire already out. He had seen the aftermath, the saved horses, the old woman safe on the porch, the blackened figures of the rancher and the two native women. He rode into Bitter Willow and went straight to the saloon. "You won't believe it," he announced to the room. "Fire up at Ward's place. Lightning strike. Came down the north draw like a freight train. I rode like hell. Thought he was done for." "And?" a man asked. "Fire's out. Stopped dead at the creek. And here's the thing. That shy fella, he saved his whole herd. An old Lark of Dawn, from the mesa. She was visiting. He carried her out." The saloon went quiet. The crude jokes died on their lips. "And his two women?" the bartender asked, his voice lower. "They weren't hiding," the rancher said, wiping his face. "One of 'em rode flank on that fire like she was kin to it. Turned the whole herd. The other one, I think she tried to stop it with a water trough. They're all three of 'em tougher than a $2 steak." The story spread. The man they had mocked, the man they had planned to shame, had faced a real trial. Not a social one, and he had not broken. He had saved his stock. He had saved an elder. The narrative of the timid, sinful rancher was beginning to crack. That night, The three of them sat on the porch. They didn't talk. There were no words. They just sat, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the sound of the earth cooling. They were all breathing in the same rhythm, the ragged, weary breath of survival. The smell of ash was on everything. But under it, from the creek, was the faint, clean scent of mud and willow. The night after the fire, the cabin was still thick with the smell of smoke. Elias sat at his small table, the lamp casting a low, yellow circle. His ledger was open. He had been tracking his expenses, his water levels, for years. Now, it felt like the only place he could put down the things that had no measure. His hands, blistered and wrapped in clean rags, ached. He dipped his pen. He wrote, his script careful, the nib scratching in the profound quiet. I am more afraid of causing harm than I am of being talked about. He stared at the words. It was the truest thing he had ever written. The gossip in Bitter Willow, the sneers in the saloon. Reverend Pike's judgment, they were like biting flies, annoying, even painful. But they were not real. The fire had been real. The weight of Lark of Dawn in his arms had been real. The terror in the foal's eyes had been real. To send Ishta and Kiona away now, after they had fought for his home as if it were their own, after they had seen him at his most raw and not turned away, that would be real. That would be a harm. That would be a failing he could not mend, like a broken leg on a horse. He closed the book. The next day, the work of cleaning the black scar began. Ishta found him by the creek, where the fire had hissed and died. He was looking at the line between the black and the green. "The fire test is done," she said, her voice quiet. "The town test comes next. The Reverend's meeting is in 2 days." Elias nodded, his throat tight. "You have not given your answer," Ishta said, not as an accusation, but as a fact. "And we will not ask for it, but you must know what our yes means. It is not the yes of your town." She looked up at the sky, at the clear, smoke-washed blue. "We have a ceremony. It is called the Pledge Under the Wind. It is not done in a building, with a book. It is done on the land, just before the sun. You speak your promise, alone, to the east. If your heart is true, the wind takes the words and holds them forever. If your heart is false, the wind scatters them, and they are as if they were never spoken." She looked at him. "There is no paper. There is no reverend. Only the land and the truth. That is our way." It was a thing of terrible, simple beauty. It was as strong as the earth and as fragile as a breath. Kiona joined them, her hands stained with charcoal from clearing the fence line. She had heard. "The wind is good for a promise," she said, her voice rough, "but it does not raise a child. A child born of this will have 2 voices, ours and yours." She stepped closer to Elias. Her gaze was as intense as it had been the first day, but the suspicion was gone. Now, it was a challenge. "It must not be a torn thing. If you are to be its father, you must learn our voice, so it hears you in both tongues. You must learn our songs." She looked down at the burnt earth. "And you must learn to kneel. My people kneel to plant seeds. We kneel to honor the earth that feeds us." She looked back at him, her eyes sharp. "Your people kneel in your church to beg your God for forgiveness. I have seen them. If you do this, you will kneel with us. You will kneel to plant. You will not kneel to beg." The weight of it settled on him. It was not a demand for submission. It was a demand for active, honorable participation. The outside world was not done with him. The next afternoon, a lone rider came. It was Reverend Pike, his face set in an expression of profound, pastoral concern. He did not dismount, but sat his horse, a tall, black-clad judge. "Mr. Ward," he called. "Elias, I have come as a friend, not as a preacher." Elias walked out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood in the yard. "Waiting. I heard of your courage in the fire. My son," Pike said, his voice softening. "You saved a life. It was a true act of Christian charity. The town is impressed." Elias said nothing. He knew this was a preamble. It is because of that courage that I fear for your soul." Pike continued, "I see a good man, a brave man, being led into darkness by temptation, by the strange ways of the heathens." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, black-bound Bible. He held it out. "I have brought you this. I am holding a private prayer meeting for you in my study. Just you and me. Let us kneel together and ask God to deliver you from this confusion, to set your feet back on the path of righteousness." He urged his horse a step closer. "Take this, son. Read the word. Do not defile God's given order. He made man and woman, one flesh, in holy matrimony. This arrangement, it is an abomination in his sight. Banish these women. Cleanse this house." The old Elias would have taken the book. He would have mumbled his thanks and his shame, and hidden. But the man who stood in the yard was not the old Elias. The fire had burned that man away. Elias looked at the outstretched Bible, then up at the Reverend's certain, unbending face. "I thank you for your concern, Reverend," Elias said. His voice was very low, but it did not shake. "But I have been reading, not your book. I have been reading this land, and the fire, and the people." He met Pike's gaze. "And I do not see an abomination. I see a home that was saved. I see people who need help. I see a promise." He took a quiet breath. "I do not think love defies God's order. Reverend, I think it mends the tears, the ones your order sometimes leaves." Reverend Pike's face went white. Then it flushed a dark, angry red. He snatched the Bible back. "Blasphemy! You have been poisoned. You are choosing your sin." He yanked his horse's head around. "I will pray for you, Mr. Ward. We all will. At the public meeting on Sunday." He galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and judgment. That evening, Lark of Dawn was preparing to leave. Her nephew had come with the cart to fetch her. She asked Elias to walk with her to the creek. Her ankle was mending, but she leaned on a stick. She stopped at the water's edge and held something out to him. It was the buckskin seed pouch. He had given it to her for safekeeping during the fire. "I am giving this back to you," she said. He took it. The leather was warm from her hand. "You have passed the fire test," she said. "You have passed the word test with your reverend. Now comes the heart test, the final one." She nodded at the pouch. "These are our grandmothers. These are our children not yet born. You have kept them safe. If you agree to this, you will be the one to plant them, with Ishta and Kiona." She fixed him with her bright, ancient eyes. "But you must plant them with your own hand, not with a hand moved by fear, not with a hand moved by shame. Fear makes nothing grow, Elias Ward. It only makes dust. You must plant with a hand that is sure." He closed his fist around the pouch. That night, he could not sleep. The house was too small, his thoughts too large. The moon was high, casting the burnt land in a ghostly, silver light. He walked out, past the barn, to the edge of the creek. He stood at the line where the fire had stopped. He held the pouch. He could feel the small, hard, separate seeds inside. He weighed it all. The town, the shame, Felton's greed, Pike's rage. It was a heavy, ugly weight. Then he weighed the other side, the feeling of Ishta's hand over his, pressing the pouch into his palm, the look in Kiona's eyes when she pulled him from the fire, the solid, trusting weight of Lark of Dawn's hand. He thought of his own words. "I am more afraid of causing harm. To say no would be to tell them they were wrong to trust him. It would be to agree with Pike. It would be to say that their survival, their future, was less important than his comfort. It would be the greatest harm he could possibly do. He was a man who mended things. This was the greatest tear he had ever seen. He trembled, not with fear, with resolution. It was a yes that would change everything. He opened the pouch and looked at the seeds, dark and mysterious in the moonlight. He walked back to the cabin. The lamp was still low. Ishta and Kiona were sitting at the table, not talking, just waiting. They had given him the dignity of a choice, and they would not rush it. He stood in the doorway, the moonlight at his back, They looked up. He looked at Ishta, at her calm, deep eyes. He looked at Kiona, at her fierce, challenging strength. "I will learn the dawn song," he said. His voice was hoarse. He stepped inside. "I will learn to kneel, to plant." He took a ragged breath. The words were the hardest, bravest things he had ever said. "I have been chosen by you, and if you will still have me, if you still choose me, I choose you back." The silence in the room was absolute. It stretched for a long, painful beat. Then Ishta and Kiona looked at each other. It was a long, silent, profound look. It was not a look of victory. It was a look of shared, heavy, terrifying responsibility. They had just bound their future to this man. They had just built a new thing in the world, and now they would have to defend it. Ishta turned to him, and her eyes were shining in the lamplight. "We choose you, Elias Ward." Kiona let out a long, slow breath. "Then the work begins. A house with 3 posts needs a new roof. It needs its own rules." She stood up. "Your promise to the wind is our way, but the Reverend and his paper laws are his way. The wind will not stop Magnus Felton from taking your water." Elias nodded. He had known this. He had seen the path. This was his contribution. "I know," he said. "A promise for the wind, and a promise for the law." He looked at them, his mind clear for the first time. "Tomorrow morning, before the sun, we will make the pledge under the wind. You will teach me the words." He paused, then added, "And then, after the sun is up, we will not wait for the Reverend's meeting. We will go to town, all 3 of us. Not to the church, to the lawyer's office." Ishta looked at him, surprised. "Mr. Hemlock's son," Elias explained. "The one who reads books. We will have him draw up a paper, a legal contract. We will call it a joint stewardship of the land, the water, the stock, all of it, in all 3 of our names." He looked at them, his heart pounding with the rightness of it. "Not to own each other, but so we all belong to the home, so we can protect the mothers and protect the child. We will build a house that has room for both our laws." The pledge had been made. As the first pearlescent light of dawn had touched the eastern rim, Elias had stood facing the wind. He had spoken the words Najo had taught him, his voice rough and unfamiliar in the Red Mesa tongue. He spoke of his respect, his fear, and his promise to learn, to care, to stay. Ishta and Kiona had stood behind him, witnesses, and the wind, as promised, had taken the words. They had not gone to the lawyer. Not yet. That was for the morning, for the world of paper and ink. This one night, this interlude between the vow to the land and the contract with the town, was for them. They were in Willow Spine Canyon, a narrow, sheltered place a mile up the creek. The moon was a high, silver coin, so bright it washed the color from the stones and made the water of the creek glitter like a trail of fallen stars. The air was rich with the sharp, clean scent of crushed sage and the deep, resinous smell of pine. They had built a small fire, not for warmth, but for a heart. It crackled and popped, a cheerful, living sound in the vast, moonlit quiet. Elias stood apart, by the water's edge. He had done the right thing. He had said the true words. But his body was a knot of awkwardness. He was a man of horses and leather. He knew how to gentle a panicked animal, how to set a fence post straight. He did not know this. He did not know how to stand, where to look, what to do with his hands. He watched Ishta, who was staring into the flames, her face calm and thoughtful. He watched Kiona, who was oiling a bridle, her movements economical and strong. They seemed at peace. He felt like a visitor. Then Ishta looked up, her gaze finding him in the shadows. She rose, her movement fluid as water, and walked to him. Elias's heart gave a single, hard jolt. He instinctively wanted to step back, to give her space, but his boots were planted in the soft earth. She stopped in front of him, closer than she had ever been. She was not as tall as he was, but her presence was immense. She looked at his face, at the fear and confusion and hope, all warring there. And then, slowly, She lifted her hand. She did not touch his face. She did not reach for his hand. She laid her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. Her fingers splayed. Elias stopped breathing. He could feel the warmth of her hand through the thin wool of his shirt. He could feel the slight, dry texture of her skin, and she could feel his heart. It was leaping, a frantic drum against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She did not pull away. She just held her hand there, her dark eyes fixed on his, as if she were listening to the panicked rhythm. He stood, frozen. As the seconds stretched, he forced himself to breathe. The long, slow breath he used in the stable. In, out. He felt his heart, under her palm, begin to slow its frantic beat, matching his breath. A shadow moved at his side. Kiona had joined them. She was carrying a heavy, hand-woven blanket, dark red and black. She, too, stopped close. Elias was now standing between them. Kiona looked at Ishta's hand on his chest, then at his face. She did not reach for him. Instead, she unfolded the blanket and, in a gesture that was both practical and profoundly gentle, she draped it over his shoulders. It was heavy. It was warm from the fire. It was an act of protection. It was not a claim, not an act of possession. It was an act of inclusion. She was wrapping him in the warmth of her home, of her work. Elias stood, pinned by two simple, profound gestures. Ishta's hand on his heart, Kiona's blanket on his back. "You are afraid," Ishta said, her voice a low murmur, not a question. "Yes," Elias whispered. The admission rough. Not of the town, not anymore. I'm afraid of this, of getting it wrong, of not knowing the way. We are all afraid," Kiona said from his side, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "We are afraid of the world your people have built. We are afraid of bringing a child into it." She touched the blanket on his shoulder. "And we are afraid of hurting each other." Elias looked at her, then at Ishta. How do we do this?" Ishta's gaze softened. "There is no map for this. Elias, we are drawing it. We draw it together." She looked at Kiona. "Everything only moves forward when all three of us breathe as one." Elias felt that. He had felt it, in the fire. He had felt it at the creek. Ishta looked at Kiona. A long, silent question. Kiona's eyes searched Elias's face. Then she gave a single, slow nod. Ishta took her hand from his chest and, moving with the same slowness, she stepped a fraction closer. She raised both hands and cupped his face. Her hands were calloused, like his, but they were gentle. She tilted his head down and touched her forehead to his. His world shrank to that single point of contact, the scent of her hair, clean and smoky, the warmth of her skin. Their breath mingled in the small space between them. His tasting of coffee, hers of sage. His own hands, which had been hanging uselessly, slowly rose. He did not know what he meant to do, but they moved. He placed one hand on her waist, feeling the solid strength of her. The other hand he raised to her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone. His touch was hesitant, as slow and deliberate as if he were planting a seed in fragile earth. He felt her sigh, a soft release of breath against his lips. He looked, his eyes still close to hers, to Kato Kiona, who stood by his shoulder, her hand resting on the blanket. She watched them, her face unreadable. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Is this right?" Kiona's face softened. She nodded. Once. Elias looked back at Ishta. Her eyes were closed. She was waiting. He leaned in, and his lips touched hers. It was not a kiss of passion, or of hunger. It was a kiss of profound, startled discovery. It was long and gentle, and unbelievably soft. It tasted of the creek, of clean water, and faintly of wood smoke. Her lips were dry and warm. As he kissed her, he felt Kiona's hand slide from the blanket to his shoulder, her grip firm and supportive. His own hand moved from Ishta's waist to her back, holding her. Her arms went around his neck. They were not two people stealing a moment. They were three people building one. He broke the kiss, but they remained close, foreheads touching. He was breathing hard now, but it was not from fear. Kiona unfolded the blanket on the ground, spreading it on a patch of soft pine needles near the fire. She sat, then Ishta. They looked up at him. He sat with them. For a long time, they just watched the fire, the silence comfortable now, filled with the new reality of that one simple kiss. Then, they began to talk. It was not the talk of the ranch, or the town, or the law. They spoke of things no one else had ever heard. Kiona spoke first. She told them of a younger sister, lost not to the winter of the cattle, but to a measles outbreak 5 years before. She described her sister's laugh, how it sounded like pebbles in a fast creek. Ishta, her voice low, told a story of a dream she'd had as a girl, of a pinto mare that had wings and carried her to the moon. She spoke of her grandmother, who had taught her to read the stars, and Elias, his voice rusty with disuse, spoke of his mother. He told them how she'd come from the east, a gentle woman who had loved the harsh land. He told them how she'd given him the strange seed mix, calling it her hope for a stubborn future. He confessed his deepest, most buried secret that for 10 years, his greatest dream had not been of wealth or of a bigger ranch. It had been of a night just like this, of a fire, and of not being alone. There was a moment of soft, shared laughter when he admitted he had once tried to bake bread, and had created a rock so hard his horses could not eat it. They lay back on the blanket, side by side. Elias was in the middle. Ishta was on his left, Kiona on his right. They were not touching. Not yet. They were just 3 people, looking up at the sky between the canyon walls. The fire crackled. The creek whispered. As the night deepened, the air grew cooler. Elias felt Ishta shiver beside him. Without thinking, he pulled a corner of his own blanket, the one Kiona had given him, and draped it over her. She sighed, a sound of pure comfort, and shifted, her shoulder pressing against his, on his other side. Kiona moved, turning onto her side to face him, her head propped on her hand. She did not touch him, but she was close. He could feel the warmth radiating from her. Her long, heavy braid fell across his arm. He did not move. He just let it rest there, a quiet, heavy, trusting weight. Ishta shifted again, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. He felt the soft brush of her hair against his neck. He lay there, pinned by this new, gentle reality. Kiona's braid on his arm, Ishta's head on his shoulder, the warmth of their bodies seeping into his. He could feel Ishta's breath, slow and steady against his chest. He could hear Kiona's, just as slow, just as steady. He closed his eyes, and his own breath fell into rhythm with theirs. This, he thought, this is what it means, to breathe as one. The dew was beginning to fall, a cool mist that made the embers of the fire hiss. He felt a profound, aching gratitude. He turned his head, his lips brushing the hair on Ishta's temple. He spoke, his voice a whisper, not for the wind, but for them. I will care, he murmured. I will learn. I will be here. When the dawn needs another voice, mine will be here. He felt Ishta's hand find his, her fingers lacing with his own. On his other side, he felt Kiona's hand rest on his stomach, a gesture of simple, solid presence. Then they moved. It was not a planned thing. It was an instinct. They both shifted closer, a simultaneous embrace. Ishta's arm came across his chest, her hand resting on Kiona's shoulder. Kiona's arm came around his back, her hand finding Ishta's. He was in the center of their embrace. A circle of 3. He was not trapped. He was held. He was not a visitor. He was the hearth. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of a promise made real, a profound, physical commitment, led not by passion, but by a deep and earned respect. Magnus Felton did not like to be refused. He stood on the ridge overlooking Dry Lantern Creek, 2 miles upstream from Elias's property. With him were 2 men from his railroad crew, men who kept their mouths shut and did what they were paid for. Felton's plan had been simple: use Reverend Pike to create a moral panic, drive Ward's property value down, and buy the water rights for almost nothing. But the fire had complicated things. The town was now muttering about the shy rancher's quiet bravery. The narrative was slipping. Pike is a fool. Felton spat into the wind. A moral crusade is too slow. We need a practical disaster. Below them was an old, wide earthen dam, built years ago by beaver and reinforced by settlers, creating a large, sluggish pond. It was the source of the creek's steady flow. "You're sure about this?" Boss, one of the men asked, eyeing the heavy, paper-wrapped sticks of dynamite. "He refused $200, Felton said, as if this explained everything. "He thinks he's a hero. He thinks his family makes him strong. I will show him what real strength is. We're not just breaking his dam. We're taking his water. All of it. His plan was vicious. He would crack the dam, scouring the creek bed, ripping out Ward's fences, stables, and the lodge. He would drain the pond. By the time the mud settled, dry lantern. Creek would be just a dry, cracked scar for the rest of the year. Elias would have no water. He would be forced to sell. Further down the canyon, unseen by his men, Felton had set a second, smaller charge with a much longer, slower fuse. It was tucked against the main wooden pylon of the Bitter Willow Town Bridge. If the flood didn't ruin Ward, the chaos and the cost of a new bridge would throw the entire county into turmoil, making his land grab even easier. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as the men worked. It was the first rain of the season, cold and hard. "Light it," Felton ordered. "Let the storm take the blame." A few miles away, Deputy Cole Bristow was on a miserable patrol. He was brooding. He had been made a fool of by a quiet rancher and a native woman. He was a laughingstock in the saloon. He was angry at Elias, angry at Kiona, and, most of all, angry at Felton for putting him in that position. He heard a muffled sound from upstream, a sound of digging. He tied his horse and moved forward on foot, thinking it might be rustlers. He crested the ridge and froze. He saw Felton, he saw the dynamite, and he saw the two fuses, one short and thick, leading to the dam, the other thin and long, snaking away toward the town bridge. He watched in horror as one of the men lit the first fuse. It hissed, sputtering in the now steady rain. Felton and his men mounted up. "Let's go," Felton yelled over the wind. "The show is about to start." They rode off, not seeing Bristow in the shadows. Bristow looked at the second fuse. It was lit, too, but burning agonizingly slow. He looked at the dam. He looked at the town, at the ranch. The dawn had come, but it was a gray, weeping light. The night in the canyon had changed them. The air in the small cabin was no longer awkward. It was charged with a new, quiet intimacy. They had just sat down to a breakfast of coffee and oatmeal. The simple routine a comfort after such a profound night. They were planning their trip to the lawyer. "The rain is good," Elias said, looking out the window. "The land needs it." The first sound was a low, deep thump, so powerful it rattled the tin cup on the table. It was not thunder. It was the earth moving. "What was that?" Ishta said, rising. Before Elias could answer, the second sound came, a low, guttural roar, like 1,000 stampeding buffalo. It was growing, coming from the north. Kiona was the first to the door. She threw it open and her face went white. "Elias, the creek." Elias and Ishta joined her. The sight was apocalyptic. The small, gentle dry lantern creek was gone. In its place was a 20-foot-high wall of roiling, muddy water, trees, and debris, exploding down the narrow valley. The dam had broken. "The horses!" Elias yelled, his voice torn away by the roar. It hit the ranch with the force of a freight train. The first thing to go was the hide lodge, swept away in a single, vanishing motion. Then the water struck the fence line. The posts snapped like toothpicks. The wall of water, thick as syrup, slammed into the stables. Wood splintered. The horses screamed, a sound of pure terror. As the building disintegrated around them, the three of them ran, not away, but toward the chaos. The horses, mad with fear, were being swept up, struggling against the current. "The high ground!" Elias shouted, pointing to a small rise behind the ruined barn. A section of the stable roof, a solid 20-foot plank, was spinning in the current. It struck Elias, catching him high in the shoulder. The blow was solid, brutal. It knocked him from his feet as if he were a child. He fell backward, not onto solid ground, but into a deep sinkhole, a swirling vortex of mud and debris where the well had been. He went under. Elias, Ishta screamed his name. He surfaced, gasping, mud filling his mouth, but he couldn't get out. The mud was a living thing, a thick, cold glue that sucked at his legs, pulling him down, while the current tried to drown him. Ishta didn't think. She saw him struggling, his hands finding no purchase. She launched herself into the pit. She landed in the chest-deep mud beside him, the cold stealing her breath. "Push!" she yelled. "Use my shoulder." She tried to give him leverage, but the mud now held them both. They were stuck, two people in a sucking, freezing trap, the floodwater roaring past just inches away. Kiona saw it. She had been trying to get a rope on the frantic mare, Daisy, but she let the horse go. She ran to the wreckage of the barn, wading through the knee-deep, fast-moving water. She salvaged her lariat. She braced herself against the one remaining corner post of the cabin, the only solid thing left. "Here!" she shouted. She swung the rope, the loop landing perfectly between them. Elias grabbed it with one hand, Ishta with the other. "Pull!" Elias roared. Kiona leaned back, her muscles straining, her boots sliding in the slick mud. She wasn't strong enough. "Both of you!" she yelled. It took all three of them. Kiona provided the anchor. Ishta, bracing her feet against Elias's, used her last ounce of strength to push him up. Elias clawed his way out, his arms burning, and then, together, he and Kiona hauled a half-frozen, mud-caked Ishta from the pit. They collapsed on the small island of high ground, gasping, as the main force of the flood thundered past. But the horses were still trapped. The herd was bunched on a rapidly shrinking patch of land, the brown water swirling around their legs. They were panicked, ready to bolt into the deadliest part of the current. "I have to get them," Kiona said. She looked at the torrent. "A horse couldn't cross it. Maybe a person." She waded into the churning water, the force of it nearly taking her legs. She fought her way to a half-submerged boulder, climbed on top, and put 2 fingers in her mouth. She blew a high, sharp, 2-note whistle the call lark of dawn had taught her. The horses' heads came up. They knew that sound. It cut through the roar. She whistled again, pointing, wading back into the current to show them the path, a diagonal line across the shallowest part of the flood. One horse, then another, followed, their fear of her whistle greater than their fear of the water. One mare, Daisy, refused. She was trapped on the other side of the main current, her foal beside her. She would not cross the deepest part. "I have to get her," Elias said, his shoulders screaming in pain. He staggered into the water. It hit his waist, and the force was staggering. He felt the ground washing out from under him. "Elias, wait!" Ishta yelled. She plunged in after him. She was lighter, and the current took her. She grabbed a half-submerged fence post, her body slammed horizontal by the water. She locked her arms, her back to the current. "Here," she shouted. "Use me as a brace." She became a human bridge, a breakwater. The full, icy force of the flood struck her, pinning her, nearly drowning her, but she held. Elias grabbed her shoulder, used her anchored body to keep his footing, and plunged past her. He got the rope on the mare, and, with Kiona whistling and Elias pulling, they guided the last 2 horses to safety. Upstream, Cole Bristow was in a race. The town bridge, the fuse was burning, shorter and shorter, sizzling in the rain. He saw the dynamite, wedged against the main support. He thought of his town. He thought of the women and children who used this bridge. He thought of Felton, sitting safe in his office, willing to drown them all for a few more dollars. His loyalty didn't just break. It shattered. He ran, sliding down the muddy bank. He didn't have time to put the fuse out. He grabbed his knife, and with a desperate, sobbing curse, he hacked at the fuse, cutting it clean, just inches from the cap. He fell back, panting, the smell of sulfur in his nostrils. He looked at the dynamite sticks. Then, his face grim, he pulled them from the pylon. diffusing the trap. He had just saved Bitter Willow. The flood receded as quickly as it had come. By noon, the water was a sluggish, muddy stream again, flowing through a landscape of utter desolation. The stable was gone. The fences were gone. The lodge was gone. The ranch was a sea of stinking, black mud. The three of them stood on the porch, the only thing, besides the cabin itself, that had survived. They were all shaking. Ishta's teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't speak. Her act of bravery had drained every last bit of warmth from her body. Elias looked at her blue lips and pale face. The awkwardness of the night before was gone, burned away by fire and scoured by water. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, trying to force his own warmth into her. "Kiona, the blanket," he said, his voice rough. Kiona retrieved the one dry blanket from his bed. He wrapped it around Ishta, but she was still shaking. "You, too," he said. He pulled Kiona into the embrace, wrapping the blanket around both of them, pulling them both tight against him. They stood there for a long time, a three-person huddle, sharing the last of their warmth. His hands were no longer clumsy. They were sure. He rubbed Ishta's back, his other hand gripping Kiona's shoulder. These were not the touches of hesitant lovers. They were the touches of survivors. They were the touches of life. The news hit town like a second flood. Cole Bristow, covered in mud and carrying a sack of dynamite and a ledger, walked straight into the church. Reverend Pike was just beginning his sermon on the sins of the creek. "Reverend, stop," Bristow said, his voice raw. He dropped the sack and the ledger on the aisle. The church gasped. He told them everything. The plot, the dam, the railroad, the bridge, the ledger that proved Felton's fraud. The silence was absolute. Then, a low murmur of horror. They had been the targets. The sinners at the creek had just been in the way. The man they were here to judge had been the first victim of an attack on all of them. And he had, they realized, just survived a flood that was meant to destroy him. Reverend Pike's face was ashen. He looked at the dynamite. He looked at his congregation. His moral world had been turned upside down. He had been a tool. "May God forgive me," he whispered. He gripped the pulpit. I have sinned. I have borne false witness. I have made an error." His voice rose. "This meeting is not a judgment. It is a call for help, for our neighbors." He looked at Bristow. "This church will be open, not for a sermon, for a town meeting, a community reconciliation. Tonight." Back at the ruined ranch, Elias looked up as he heard the church bell ringing. It was not the Sunday call. It was the alarm, the call for a town meeting. He looked at the devastation. His ranch was gone. But he was not. He looked at Ishta, who was finally stopping shaking in his arms. He looked at Kiona, who was watching the town, her eyes hard. He understood. The yes he had spoken to the wind, the yes he had sealed in the canyon, was no longer a secret of the heart. It was no longer a private promise. It was a public fact. It was a declaration to the entire territory. They were a family, and they had just proven they could survive anything the land, or the men, could throw at them. The church was not a church, not today. The pews had been pushed back to create an open space in the center. It was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, damp earth, and human anxiety. The entire town of Bitter Willow was there, their faces humbled and fearful. On the other side of the aisle sat a large, silent delegation from Red Mesa, their presence a solid, dignified block of color and quiet. Lark of Dawn, Thomas Redfeather, and Najo Seven Stars sat in the front, at the head of the room, where the altar usually stood. A simple pine table had been set. Reverend Pike sat to one side, his head bowed, his hands clasped. In the center sat a woman who commanded the room without raising her voice. This was Judge Penelope Hart. She was a circuit judge. A woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that had seen every kind of frontier foolishness, and were impressed by none of it. She was the law. And she was not swayed by sermons or saloons. In the front pew sat Elias, Ishta, and Kiona. They were still damp, still streaked with mud, but they sat with a stillness that was unshakable. They were not the accused. They were the survivors. "I have reviewed the evidence," Judge Hart said, her voice cutting cleanly through the silence. She gestured to the open ledger on her table, the one Cole Bristow had retrieved. "I have heard Mr. Bristow's testimony, and I have heard the pathetic, self-serving excuses of Mr. Magnus Felton." Felton sat on a bench near the door, flanked by two men he'd never met but who now wore sheriff's stars. He was a broken man, his fine suit stained, his face the color of ash. "This is not just a case of property damage," the judge continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "This was an act of terrorism, Mr. Felton. You willfully and with malice aforethought endangered every man, woman, and child in this valley. You used dynamite to destroy a water source and to set a trap for this town's only bridge, all for commercial gain." She didn't wait for a reply. "It is the judgment of this court that all contracts held by Magnus Felton with the New Mexico territory are hereby frozen. He will pay, from his personal accounts, for the full reconstruction of Mr. Ward's ranch, and for a new community bridge. He will forfeit all claims, current and future, to the water rights of the Dry Lantern Creek, which are now affirmed as the permanent property of the Willow House Ranch, and he will serve no less than 10 years in the territorial prison." A great, collective sigh went through the room. Felton slumped, a puppet with his strings cut. Judge Hart then looked at Cole Bristow, who stood nervously by the wall. "Deputy Bristow, you acted with cowardice when you harassed these people on Mr. Felton's behalf, but you acted with profound courage when you saved this town. You put your life before your paycheck." She nodded. "You are reinstated. Your pay is doubled, effective immediately, and you will personally escort Mr. Felton to the federal marshal in Santa Fe?" Cole stood straighter, a flush of pride and shame warring on his face. He nodded, his voice thick. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." The legal matter was settled, but the human one was not. As the judge gathered her papers, Lark of Dawn stood up. She did not address the judge. She addressed the room. "The paper law has been spoken," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner. "Now the human law must be. We came to this valley seeking a future. We asked this man, Elias Ward, to help us. We did not know he was a man who stood at the heart of his entire community." She looked at the townsfolk. "You cast stones at him. You did not know he was the one sheltering you from the flood. You feared our ways. You did not know we were all, in the end, just people trying to build a home." She turned to Elias, "Ishta, and Kiona. A new home has been declared today. A new life will, we hope, come from it." Her eyes softened. "A child must have a name to know where it belongs. If a child comes from this union, it will be of the Red Mesa. It will be of Bitter Willow. It will be of the flood and the fire. We will call this child Niltsa Ta, River of Three, for the three who saved it, and so it may walk in your world. It will be called Willow Grace, for the home that sheltered it, and the mercy that saved it." A murmur went through the room. It was a naming, a public, formal, undeniable declaration. Judge Hart, who had been packing her satchel, paused. She looked at the three of them. She had handled land disputes, murders, and cattle rustling. She had never handled this. "Mr. Ward," she said, her voice losing its judicial sharpness, "your friends have lost their home in the flood. The court has ordered yours rebuilt. But what is the legal standing of this household?" Elias stood. He was terrified, his voice shaking, but he spoke. "That's what we were coming to see a lawyer about, ma'am." "Before the flood." He looked at Ishta, then Kiona. They stood with him. "We are a family. We want a paper, one that says so, one that protects all of us, especially the mothers and the child." Judge Hart stared at him. She had seen everything. She thought she had. She put her satchel down. "Mr. Clerk," she said, "take out a fresh sheet of paper. This is not a standard filing." For the next hour, she questioned them. She did not judge. She listened. She asked Ishta what she needed. That my child is never taken from me. That my voice is equal. She asked Kiona. That our property is shared. That no one can be cast out. That our ways are respected. She asked Elias. That my promise to provide is written. That I am bound to them. And they to me. And all of us to the child. Judge Hart dictated. And the clerk's pen flew. The document she created was a pioneer's document, as tough and flexible and unprecedented as the land itself. She called it a covenant of joint stewardship and child-rearing. It stated that the property known as Willow House was held in common, in 3 equal shares. It stated that all livestock, water rights, and assets were jointly owned. It stated that any children born to this union would be under the equal and irrevocable guardianship of all 3 signatories. It contained a clause, written at Elias's shy request, explicitly banning any act of violence, of the hand or of the heart, by any member of the household against another. And last, it contained a clause that made the clerk's hand pause. All children of this stewardship, Judge Hart dictated, shall be raised bilingually, instructed in the customs, language, and songs of the Red Mesa Band, and in the laws, letters, and traditions of the New Mexico Territory. They shall know how to hear both. When she was done, she read it aloud. The church was silent. "Reverend Pike," the judge said, "you are a man of God. Is there anything in this document that offends your faith?" Reverend Pike, his face pale and lined, stood slowly. He looked at the 3 of them. He looked at the dynamite Bristow was now removing from the church. He looked at his congregation, who were looking to him, not for judgment, but for guidance. He opened his Bible, his hands shaking. He did not read from the Old Testament. He did not read of law or sin. He read from Corinthians. "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass." His voice, stripped of its righteous boom, was simply that of an old, tired man. He read of patience, of kindness, of bearing all things, of believing all things. When he finished, he closed the book. I see only charity here," he whispered. "I see a new thing, and it is good." He looked at Judge Hart. "God forgive me, it is a blessing." "Then let us sign," said the judge. She signed first, her signature a sharp, clear line. Elias signed, his hand clumsy. Ishta and Kiona signed with a simple, elegant mark. "This document is legal," Judge Hart declared, "but a community document needs community witnesses. Who will sign?" Lark of Dawn stepped forward and made her mark. Then Thomas Redfeather, his face stern, but his gesture firm. Then Najo 7 Stars. Then, for the town. Reverend Pike walked forward, his hand trembling, and signed his name. Cole Bristow signed after him. Then Mrs. Gable, the old woman Elias had helped, then the blacksmith, then the rancher who had first brought the news of the fire. One by one, the people of Bitter Willow came forward, signing their names to a document that was not just a legal contract, but a peace treaty. When it was done, Elias, Ishta, and Kiona stood by the table, looking at the page, at the 2 columns of names and marks, a bridge of ink on paper. Ishta turned to Elias. She reached into a pouch at her belt and took out a thin, supple strip of braided leather. Tied into it were 3 small, hammered silver beads. She took his right hand, the one that had signed, and she tied the thong around his wrist. "This is not a bond," she said, her voice for him alone. "It is a reminder. You kept your word to us. You kept your word to the land. You kept your word to the town. Among my people, you have a new name." She pulled the knot tight. "You are he who keeps his word." Just as she finished, the bell in the steeple above them began to ring. It was the noon bell. The meeting was over. The tension broke. The doors of the church were thrown open, and the sunlight, clear and bright after the storm, flooded in. People began to move, to talk, their voices low. but not hostile. They were making plans. Plans to help clear the mud. Plans to raise a new barn. Elias, Ishta, and Kiona walked out into the bright, muddy yard. And they saw a new sight. The children of the town, who had been kept inside, were now playing. And with them were the children from Red Mesa, who had come with the delegation. They were all in the mud, a mix of pale skin and brown, laughing, throwing a loop of rope over a fence post. No one was watching them. No one was telling them to stay apart. Elias looked at Ishta, then at Kiona. His heart felt too large for his chest. He touched the leather strip on his wrist. "Well," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "if a child comes, it will know how to hear both the bell and the drum." Ishta's eyes filled with tears, and she smiled. Kiona put her arm around Ishta's waist and, with her other hand, she gripped Elias's arm, her fingers biting deep. Elias looked at them, at the broken town, at the hopeful children. He reached into his own pocket and his fingers closed around the small, heavy buckskin pouch. Najo's seeds. He had promised to plant them. He had promised to kneel. He looked at the churchyard, at a patch of earth near the steps, scoured clean by the flood. "Wait," he said. He walked to the patch of mud, his two partners at his side, in front of the entire town, in front of the judge and the reverend. Elias Ward knelt. He opened the pouch. He poured a few of the dark seeds into Ishta's palm, and a few into Kiona's. He kept a few for himself. And together, the three of them, a man and two women, a new family. They pushed the ancestral seeds into the wet, healing earth. It was a public act, a planting, a promise, made of earth and people and law, taking root in the public square. The spring that followed the flood was a miracle of renewal. The land, scoured black by fire and then buried in mud, healed itself with a fierce, green tenacity. The scars vanished. The small patch of earth in the churchyard, where they had planted the ancestral seeds, had sprouted. A small, defiant patch of green against the white church walls. At the ranch, life had found its new, deep rhythm. The community, bound by the shared threat and the public reconciliation, had come together. The stable was rebuilt, stronger than the last. The scent of fresh-cut pine mixing with the sweet smell of hay. The fences were reset. The cabin was scrubbed clean. At the entrance to the property, where the simple gate had been, Elias had hung a new sign. He had carved it himself, his hands no longer hesitant. It was a thick plank of willow wood. In clean, clear letters, it said, "Willow House," and carved beneath it, in the elegant symbolic script of the Red Mesa people, were the words, "A home for wanderers." It was a declaration, in two tongues, that this was a place of sanctuary. The porch was wider now, built to hold a family. Ishta sat there in a rocking chair that Elias had made, her gaze soft as she looked out over the waving field of oats they had planted together. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket beaded with blue, slept their child. A girl, born just as the first new grass had appeared. She had Kiona's strong mouth and Elias's quiet, deep-seeing eyes. They called her Willow Grace in town. They called her River of Three at home. In the yard, Kiona was teaching. Her fierceness had found a new focus. It had softened into a powerful, patient instruction. She was kneeling on the grass with a half-dozen children. Some were from the town. Some were her own cousins from the mesa. She was showing them how to tie the complex cradle knot, the one Lark of Dawn had seen on Elias's wrist. Her voice was firm but kind, and a small, tow-headed boy from the town beamed with pride as he finally got it right. She was also teaching them the sharp, two-note whistle, the one that could turn a herd, or find a lost friend in the dark. Elias sat on the bottom step, a worn book in his lap. He was reading aloud, his voice no longer the rough, shy whisper of a year ago. It was a father's voice, a husband's voice. It was deep, patient, and steady, and the children drifted between Kiona's rope lessons and Elias's stories of rabbits and coyotes. Their life was one of quiet work, but they were no longer isolated. The bridges they had built were real. Deputy Cole Bristow was a regular visitor. He had come by just that morning, off duty, his hat in his hand. He had left a small, hand-carved wooden flute on the porch. "For the little one," he'd mumbled to Elias, his face red, but his eyes clear. "So, she has music." Even Reverend Pike came. He was a changed man, the rigid certainty in his eyes replaced by a humble, searching light. He did not come with a Bible. He came with a loaf of bread, still warm from his wife's oven. He and Elias spoke now, not of sin, but of the weather and the water levels and the growth of the oats in the churchyard. And Lark of Dawn, she came and sat on the porch, and she taught the dawn song, the one Elias now knew by heart. And she taught it to all the children, the ones from the town and the ones from the mesa. She was giving the song away, planting it in the one soil that would always hold it the next generation. In the late afternoons, Elias would often walk the property. He still did his chores, but they were different. They were not a ritual against loneliness. They were an act of devotion. Old Eclipse would follow him, his muzzle white with age. Elias would wear the thin leather thong Ishta had tied on his wrist, the 3 silver beads a constant, smooth weight. He who keeps his word. He would check the new stable, smell the hay, run his hands over his horses. He would check the water in the creek, flowing clear and strong. Every step was a promise kept. The house was warmest at night. The kitchen, once a sparse, silent room, was now the center of their world. It smelled of roasting corn and stew, of sage and coffee. The 3 of them would sit at the table, the baby in her cradleboard nearby. The passion of that night in the canyon had not faded. It had simply transformed. It was no longer a spark in the dark. It was the hearth that warmed their entire home. It was in the way Elias's hand found Ishta's on the table, their fingers lacing together without a thought. It was in the way Kiona would lean against his shoulder as she read one of the letters that had come. It was in the long, shared looks that needed no words. It was in the way all 3 of them would move to comfort the baby, their hands brushing, their purpose one. It was a love built not on a fleeting desire, but on the unshakable foundation of shared survival, mutual respect, and a profound, quiet, daily tenderness. Their new life rippled outward. Tucked into the rafters of the main room were scraps of paper, letters and notes left by strangers, travelers, families whose wagons had broken, drifters who had lost their way. They were all messages of thanks, left for the wanderer's home. One read, "My children were sick. Your wives tended them. Your husband shod my horse. We have no money, but we leave this prayer." Another, shorter, note. "I slept on your porch and was not turned away. I was not forgotten." Magnus Felton was a name spoken only in the past. He was in the territorial prison, his assets seized. Judge Hart had, as promised, ensured the water rights were distributed fairly, to the small farms and to the Red Mesa Band. She had written Elias once. She had informed him that the Willow House Covenant had become a precedent. She had used its framework, its language of shared stewardship and bilingual respect, to settle 2 other bitter disputes in other territories. Their private family, built of necessity, had become a model for a new kind of frontier justice. That night, Elias sat by the fire, long after the women and the child were asleep. He opened his old ledger. He turned past the pages of numbers and failures to a clean, new leaf. He picked up his pen, the silver beads on his wrist cool in the firelight. He thought of the fire, the flood, the judgment, and the love. He wrote, "Strength is not in what you can break, or even in what you can endure." I see that now. Strength is daring to love and daring to make. It is not needing anyone to lose. It is just needing no one to be forgotten. He closed the book. The cabin was warm and quiet, filled with the sound of his family's breathing. From outside, through the open window, he heard a thin, sweet melody. It was Cole Bristow, on his own porch, practicing his flute. As the last light faded, the sound was joined by the slow, gentle ringing of the evening bell from Reverend Pike's church, and then, from far off, faint but steady on the wind, came the heartbeat of the Red Mesa drum. The flute, the bell, the drum. They played together in the twilight, a new song for a new West. one being built not with arrogance and gunfire, but with a quiet, disciplined, and courageous kindness. Thank you for listening to this story. If you believe that kindness can be as tough as any gunslinger, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and tell me where you're listening from, so we can all share in this journey. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and support us by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more folks.